So over the lifespan of Old Crow, a lot of cars have come in and out. You've done restoration work and preservation work. You've worked on your own stuff, but you've also taken some commissions, right?
A few, or I'll get something that I know we're just going to sell,
right?
You know.
And so I know that you're really intent on preserving, like period builds and so forth. How do you go about that? Because it's really easy to erase history when you're working on a car that's maybe had a rough life or needs quite a bit of rehabilitation. So.
True. I guess it's the same approach I take with the architecture, and I think that my experience with restoring cars has helped me so much with restoring a building or, say, a historical business. But you have to start with a lot of research, a lot of pictures, a lot of searching for photos and images. I mean, pictures tell 1,000 words, like they say. So I'll do tons and tons of just visual research. And of course, if there's any written research, we'll do a lot of that as well. And then you also have to have a good sense of materials and build quality of the era. That's another thing. And I see people screwing up a lot, not only cars, also with buildings or architecture, because they're using modern materials. So they're using something that stands out as that would never have been done at the time. So I'll ask myself that question a lot. If I want to do something to something, I say, would this have been done at that time? And then if you have to answer that question and say, no, it wouldn't, but it would have been done this way. They would have used this material. They would have used that material. And luckily, you know, in the world of hot rodding, there's been a huge group of traditional youngsters have grown out of the hobby, have kind of grown out of the excess of the 80s and swung back into the 90s, where they said, no, let's really look at what these guys were doing and do it exactly the way they were doing it. And I did a lot of that by reaching out to older people, you know, meeting the guys that were in their 80s who had done it in the 40s and spend hours with them. Like, well, what did you do for the steering box? And what did you do, you know, for the drag link? And did you run it under this or over that? What about your brakes? How did you make the brakes better? And so all you have to do is just listen and like emulate.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, you know, in the 80s and into the 90s, really, the hot rod sort of became the street rod. Mm-hmm. And we had all that neon and those hot colors and modern wheels and tons of chrome. And they became really pretty, but it was not about racing or going fast so much as it was about cruising and looking really good.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's funny, you know, hot rodding has just gone through these weird ups and downs. You know, you had the whole 60s Ed Roth show car craze, which I can appreciate. I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not really a huge fan of excess.
Right.
You know, I love and appreciate mid-century modern, but it's just not my thing. You know, I'm not so much of the let's take a rocket to the moon type of guy. I'm more of like, no, let's just, you know, build something out of nothing in the garage kind of a guy. So I tend to really appreciate the nuances of pre-war design because it was a bit more function over form, or a lot more function over form.
Sure. Why waste money on candy paint when you can get triple deuces? Right?
Exactly. When you can go faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just make it go fast. Who cares really what it looks like?
Yeah.
So I kind of appreciate that a lot more than the excess of the show car era, especially of the 80s. You know. Yeah. But the 80s were excess. Not only in the car world, I mean in clothing and drugs and music and I mean you name it.
Absolutely.
It was the age of excess.
Yeah.
And so was that, you know, post-war boom of mid-century, into the 60s. And if you just watch, if you look at history a lot, you just see these pendulums. You see like the poor working class Depression era 30s, and then that slowly swings up to the 50s. TV dinner boom, and then it swings back to hippies living in vans in the 60s, and then it swings back to the 80s and the new wave era.
Right, and those same hippies that were in the vans are now in a corporate setting, and they've got a bad cocaine habit.
Probably, yeah, or they're making Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
Right.
Or they're still following the dead around. But so I kind of just always felt that, like, if your interests just stay classic, just classy and classic.
Test of time.
You never have to go through these phases of having to change your life. I got to get rid of my wardrobe now.
Yeah.
Shoulder pads are out. I need a fatter tie now. Wow. So yeah, I don't have time for trends. I just stick with the tried and true Americana.
Well, now, and the other thing too, Bobby, is that the speed equipment industry was born in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I mean, Iskandarian, Miller, the list goes on and on. Edelbrock.
Yeah, Edelbrock. I mean, you name it. And what an industry it became. I mean, look at SEMA nowadays. It's a massive, massive industry. Of course, there's good and bad to that, because I think the industry kind of ate itself. The Street Rodder, for instance, Street Rodder magazine, it was a vicious cycle. It was like, well, we're going to feature cars that have a lot of our advertisers' parts on them, and vice versa. So it just becomes this circle. And then, of course, then you're influencing, people to build these cars. And then, 10 years later, you pull the rug out from under them. Now it's all about traditional rods. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, you told us a little bit about Old Crow, your Billy Tank racer, but let's talk about racing itself. And mainly we're talking about at El Mirage Dry Lake, right? And at Bonneville.
Bonneville Soft Flats, yeah.
Walk us through that experience.
So I think my racing progression, I guess you'd call it, has kind of always been a sense to recreate. Like, man, you look at pictures from the earliest days of drag racing, guys who were out on the aircraft drag strip or something like that. No helmets, no roll cages, none of that stuff. Like, wow, I wonder what that was like, So then I think one of the first things I ever did was go to the Antique Nationals, which was a drag race for guys who just had hot rods or motorcycles. And it was just about, like, see what your car will do, and you didn't need much. You just needed a lap belt and a helmet. And so that really was a lot of fun, just doing fun little drag racing. And so, like anything, like me, who's kind of like obsessive and a workaholic, a perfectionist, like I want to just keep pushing whatever it is I do, keep pushing myself to do more and more. And so after drag racing a bunch, it's kind of like, well, what else? What's next? What else did these guys do? And you start, and you meet some of these old guys who are like, well, before drag racing, we'd go out to the desert and we'd drive for a mile as fast as we could go. And you're like, really? And then they say, yeah, these guys are still doing it. Why don't you come with me next Sunday? And so that's kind of how it started. Gotcha. A guy named Tom Evans and a guy named Julian Doty were kind of my mentors. And so go out to El Mirage. It was still happening. These guys were still doing it. I think there was Muroc Dry Lake, which is now Edwards Air Force Base. They had a reunion because Muroc had been shut down since like World War II. Right. But they had a couple reunions in the 90s. So you went out to that and you see these guys that are still racing. And so that got me really hooked. And but being the traditionalist I am, I saw that most of the cars that were racing, and even the guys that had started in the 40s and were still racing, were racing different cars. They were racing way more modern because to them, and rightly so, their entire life goal was to go faster and faster. So they would stretch their car and shrink their car and make get smaller wheels and tires for their car and all the things it took to make that car faster. But to me, I was a nostalgic lover, and so I'm looking at the old books, the old black and white photos of these same guys when they're like 19 years old, and it's just a bone stock, stripped down, 29 Roadster or a belly tank. A belly tank was kind of like the quintessential land speed car of early post-war era. So I didn't necessarily want to just jump on board with what those older guys were doing because they've been doing it their whole life. I kind of wanted to start back where they started and see what was that like. What was it like to take a car that's primarily stock Ford parts, nothing modern, and make it go as fast as possible. And what's neat about it is there's SCTA books that have the records of what these guys did. So you could look in 1948 and see what a guy running a Model A engine with an overhead valve conversion, with this type of body style, you see what speed he did. And it was only short-lived because then the V8 flathead came out. So everyone jumped over to that to go faster. And then the Chevy came out. Everyone jumped to that to go faster.
331 CAD.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And then
Hemis.
the Hemis.
Then the Hemis came along, and then they started drag racing on the strip. But so I would look at records from 1948. Say, okay, this belly tank had this motor, this thing. I want to try to beat that. You know what I mean? Like pick up where they left off and try to go faster. And we did. Me and my friends did it.
Yeah.
So that's the fun part of it.
What's your record speed in the Old Crow?
Old Crow fastest run at Bonneville was 168.
Wow.
Which doesn't sound like a lot because, I could go buy a 350 Chevy and throw it in there and probably do 200 miles an hour right out the gate. But it really wasn't about that. It was about doing as fast as you could go with technology from 1948. That's what it was about. So it was 168 was a hell of a lot of work.
I believe it.
We did a lot to that motor to get it to go there.
Now, you said that's a Model A 4-cylinder.
Yeah, it's a 32 Ford 4-cylinder. Top speed of that car when it was brand new was probably maybe 60 miles an hour. Downhill, maybe 65. So, you have to take that block. You have to put a better crank in it, add some main caps. We put an overhead cam conversion on it, which they were doing. They were doing back in the 30s.
Right.
Supercharge it, put a blower on it.
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think Louis Chevrolet was building speed equipment for those engines after he left Chevrolet.
Yeah, he was building the Frontenac.
That's right.
That was speed equipment for the Model T blocks. So
okay, Model T.
We're talking, late teens.
Right.
And the Frontenac was quite an engine. Double overhead cam. 8 valve or 16 valve deals. That's the same stuff Miller was messing with.
Right.
That's like rocket science for the 1920s.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To your average hot rodder, that was some crazy stuff. Because even the hot rodders, even the kids in the 40s, even 50s, they weren't messing around with the kind of technology that the guys in the 20s were doing, like Harry Miller, like the Frontenac brothers. There ain't no slacking when you're frontenacking was the slogan, which is pretty good, right?
It is.
But we're talking about high dollar stuff. We're talking about the Bugatti of America stuff. So of course your average teenager coming out of World War II didn't have access to that type of thing, even years later. But America was kind of running, alongside, slightly behind Europe in the early days of racing. Europe really ruled racing, and in Europe, racing was a rich guy's hobby. So major advancements were created because they had the money to do it. And it wasn't until a little later in the U.S. that guys started having the money. A lot of guys here in Los Angeles had the money to spend. So there was a guy named Harry Miller, and he started out building carburetors. He had a shop in Los Angeles building carbs. And then he got into repairing race engines and trying to make race engines for guys. And he was making kind of what other guys in the U.S. were making at the time, really large 4 cylinders, maybe 6 cylinders, 8 cylinders, really big, massive things. T-heads, flatheads, that type of deal. And so it just happened that around 1914, 1915, Peugeot from France sent some race cars over to the U.S. They competed in Indy. They competed in some of the tracks, Beverly Hills, Culver City, the board tracks, and they were going real fast. And they had what basically is the same geometry as engines today: double overhead cam, 16 valve, straight 8 engines, and we didn't have those yet. And so one of them happened to break here in LA and got sent to Miller's shop to repair. And so luckily Harry Miller got a hold of it for a year or two to fix it. So he basically just took it apart, saw the technology that was being used, and said, we can do this. And that's what they did. So Harry Miller came out with a 183 cubic inch double overhead cam, 16 valve, straight 8 race engine. The greatest engine of all time for the era. Talking late teens, early 20s. At that time, Duesenberg was dominating the oval tracks, Indy, and competing with the European guys that were coming over. But once Miller got into the game, and once he perfected his engines, say in the early 20s, he was dominating Indy and did for decades. He retired and passed the shop on to his foreman, which was Fred Offenhauser. And, later on into the 30s, they came to realize that 4 cylinders worked better than 8. You could get the same horsepower, if not more, out of a more compact, less weight type of deal. More bang for the buck, so to speak. So 4 cylinders became all the rage in the 30s. And then Fred Offenhauser created the Offie motor, which we now know as the Offie, but it was really the Miller or the Peugeot, depending on who you want to give the credit to. And so Offie dominated Indy up until the 80s.
It's incredible.
It's totally nuts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Until the Ford, Cosworth and type motors came out, and that changed the game. But up until then, this aluminum 4-banger dominated American racing, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, it is absolutely astounding. That engine was in nearly every car that ran at Indy.
Yeah, it really was.
With some notable exceptions here and there, but it was that good. The engineering was that sound. It was that, I guess, flexible.
Yeah. It was just finely tuned. They had reached perfection with that engine. And they kept advancing it forward. They turbocharged it later into the 70s and kept going faster and faster. And but that is the the Rolls Royce of American racing. And I got really fascinated by that history because, like I said, progression. If you live a life of progression, which I do, which always trying to achieve the next thing or achieve or learn more or dive deeper into what you want to know about, then eventually, as an automotive connoisseur, you're gonna head back to the early days of American racing.
Well, it's funny that you say that because that's really, we've come so far in 120 years, 125 years. And yet, much of the technology that we're talking about was developed in the first 20 years of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So true. And only thing different is computers.
Yeah.
That's changed, valve timings
Right.
and carb richness and whatnot. But other than that, you're dealing with the same geometry.
And so I wanted to kind of share those stories with people and capture the history of it. And that was the whole point of starting the podcast and doing these interviews and learning from people like you. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's so many rabbit holes.
Oh,
that's the beauty of it. I mean, there's so many rabbit holes to explore.
Yeah.
In just American racing. Forget about getting into European racing.